I wanted to make just a couple brief comments. When I was listening to Ken's talk, I thought about an agnostic. Gnosis is the Greek word. You put an A in front of it, it's no knowledge. But then what if you had the dyslexic agnostic? He would stay up late at night wondering whether there is or isn't a dog.
That's right.
And then with Loreto, I thought philosophy is easy and hard, and mind your P's and Q's.
There you go. There
All
you
right.
go.
Now, here is, I want to read to you from Mortimer Adler. Professor Adler was a distinguished philosopher, a specialist in Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, also an educator. He wrote a book entitled The Difference of Man and the Difference It Makes. And here's what he said. He said, the problem of how man differs from other animals in degree or in kind is not a purely philosophical problem, nor is it a purely scientific problem. It is a mixed problem, both scientific and philosophical, the solution to which requires knowledge of relevant scientific evidence and also philosophical competence in the interpretation of that evidence. I would think he would also include theology. And this seems to be that integrationist position. Now, let me develop this question a little bit further here. He goes on to say this. He says, men and other animals differ in degree if both possess the same trait, but one possesses more of it than the other, and the other less. Then it gets a bit complicated. He says, men and other animals differ in kind if men either have certain powers or perform certain acts that are not present in other animals in the slightest degree. What I'd like to ask you is this. Adler talks about powers and acts. In my book, I say human beings are unique in 7 ways. They have an inherent spiritual and religious nature. They have unique intellectual, cultural, and communicative abilities. They're conscious of time, reality, and truth. They possess a conscience, identify a value system, legislate moral laws for society. Human beings are uniquely inventive and technological. They possess an intense curiosity to explore and understand the entire created realm. And then finally, they possess an aesthetic taste and appreciation for more than just practical purposes. So here's my first question. You both referenced the imago Dei, the image of God. It sounds like Adler is saying that human beings are different in kind because they have powers, rational powers, they're spiritual, they're moral, they have these capacities, but also they act. Yep. They're political animals. They're religious animals. They are aesthetic. So tell me a little bit how you would react to what Adler says about powers and acts, and do you accept his interpretation there?
You want to take it?
Go ahead and type on to that.
Well, of course, being an act, we would argue, like I said, we are incurable manifestations of the imago Dei in that since we are in the divine image, therefore we can't help but be manifestations of, that's why we say, that humans are incurable culture makers. In other words, because of who we are, we can't help but do what we do. And I think that that would be something that we would agree with Adler entirely. Going back to who we are, one of the things I was trying to say in my talk is that almost everything that we value about humans, that we say that this is how we are different in kind. almost every one of those things, in fact, I would argue every one of those things, has a theological start. Take the very notion when I was trying to explain the very notion of person, the very question about that's the conversation in the public square. What are persons and personhood? What we forget, and it seems to, we have a bit of amnesia here, is it is the early church fathers that gave us our modern understanding of person. There's a number of good works that give a good history of the notion of person. And in the ancient world, slaves were homo. We were all human beings, but only citizens, Roman citizens, were persona, were persons. And the very idea of personhood and all of the value that, I have to treat you with dignity because you are a person. And we see this whole question, and one of the reasons why we're having trouble in the law, we're having trouble in culture, we're having trouble in ethics, is because the Western world has forgotten the very notion of what we mean by person. And so trying to build an empirical definition of person, it's operational, it ends up being this long laundry list of things that just, these are the things that persons do. Okay, well then what happens then if we have someone who doesn't manifest all of that long laundry list? For example, Singer's point that an infant is not self-aware. And one of the characteristics, we'd say, of a person is that a person is self-aware. And so for that reason, he argues that it's all right to commit infanticide because the infant is not self-aware. Well, I would, as a Christian, I think most of us, and here's the thing, even non-Christians find that very disturbing. Why? Well, because they have been taught and trained in the Western tradition of the way Christians thought. Infanticide was practiced all the time in the Greco-Roman world. They cast out children, as a matter of course if they didn't want them. It was something that the early Christians taught, that this is wrong to do that to these infants because they are persons in the image of God. And so the very idea of how we're supposed to understand, that goes back to what I was trying to say. We have to understand who we are, and then we can talk about the things that we do. So rather than looking upon an infant as a potential person, I'd rather say the infant is a person with potential.
All right. I can add to what has been said. I have a book coming out on taking persons seriously, and I have a chapter in that book where I argue that a degreed notion of personhood is incoherent. There's no such a thing as degreed notion of a person. So the 17th century philosopher John Locke, a British philosopher, was immensely influential to modern understanding of what it means to be a person. So John Locke has, in his essays concerning human understanding, two important definitions that people like Peter Singer, Daniel Dennett, Michael Tooley tapped into in order to defend their own, let's say, infanticide or very controversial ethical issues. Okay, here is what John Locke said. John Locke said that to be a person is to have self-concept. Some of the characterizations, these are ontological characterizations. Self-concept, tracking your own identity over time. So identity can be tracked in two ways. It can be tracked at a time, what we call synchronic identity, or over time, what we call diachronic identity. For example, what grounds your identity between yesterday and today? You did exist yesterday, you do exist now, but what grounded your identity between yesterday and now? That's what we call diachronic identity. So John Locke talked about that self-concept is all about self-awareness, metacognition. Cognition is a first-order concept. Metacognition is thinking about cognition. For example, if you take philosophy, philosophy is a second-order discipline. Meta-philosophy is literally studying philosophy itself. Okay? And we have ontology that studies what there is. Meta-ontology is thinking about ontology. So I'm bringing all of these things to show that we have incredibly complicated capacity. Not only excellent things that you mentioned earlier on, I have a second-order capacity to literally think about myself. So if you bring your dog, how can you tell me that the dog has self-concept? Do you think the dog thinks that, oh, I am a dog? I'm so happy for being a dog. Do you think a dog reflexively thinks about itself? This is incredible capacity that human beings have. And I think that's completely puts us on a different trajectory, on a different level. We do have that incredible capacity. Here's the second definition of John Locke, forensic notion of personhood. Forensic notion of personhood is all about taking accountability for your actions. Okay? You should be able to own it. John Locke proposed this because of general resurrection. God, when he dispenses reward and punishment during the general resurrection, he shouldn't mistake you for me and vice versa. How does he figure that out? I should be able to remember everything that I have done in my life. Therefore, based on that testimony, God will send me, this is what you deserve, this is where you have to go, and so on. So the idea here is we have the second order capacity. I don't think other animals do have that. Does this mean that putting them down? No. Undermining them? Absolutely not. But many things follow from that. From self-consciousness, many things follow. And okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but to your point, not only is it memory, in order to have moral responsibility, you also have to have imagination.
Yep.
In other words, you have to be able to think counterfactually. You have to be able to think, okay, that which I remember that which I did. I can imagine I could have done otherwise. In fact, I should have done otherwise. And so therefore, I'm wrong because I did A and I could have done B. And so in order for there to be moral responsibility, there not only has to be memory, there has to be imagination. And for that reason, that's why we don't think, I mean, like I said, I use Harry when I teach theology. I talked about, Harry being a bad dog. I use Harry whenever I'm teaching a class on the age of accountability, because simply perceiving that you disobeyed or that my master is not happy with me. In other words, really what's going on with the dog? Why, it's bad dog. What the dog understands is, my owner's not happy with me. Does the dog have the imagination to thought counterfactually? The answer is no. And so we don't have a guilty dog, and so therefore there's no moral culpability there. And that's the thing that makes us distinctly different.
Yeah. Can I also add something on power and acting?
Yes.
Okay. There is a new research in analytic philosophy called dispositions, or powers. Powers and dispositions get manifested in multiple ways. One of the ways that people use to think about the manifestation of dispositions is a stimulus-response model. So something triggers something in you, and then you respond in a certain way. That model has been shown to be ineffective, which was completely embraced during the 1950s because of behaviorism and psychology, for example, B.F. Skinner and others. So the current conception by metaphysicians, the modification that they introduced into the metaphysics of dispositions, is that the term, this is a mouthful term, and I hope everyone will bear with me, called multi-track dispositional model. multi-track. Dispositions manifest themselves in multiple paths. So here's a response for Singer. I've published arguing against Singer in other publications. They say a person is, a baby, let's say a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, is not a person, right? Because a baby is not self-aware and blah, blah, blah. No. The disposition is already there.
The potentials.
The potential is already there. It's a matter of time for the manifestation of that disposition. So it's incoherent, actually, to say that disposition all of a sudden jumps out of nowhere when the baby reaches to age 5. What was not there in the first place is not going to come out at some point along the continuum. So therefore, the Michael Tolley and Peter Singer and Daniel Lee's conception of personhood is deeply flawed. And the multi-track dispositional model simply gives us this excellent opportunity to deal with that. Consider, for example, people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. What is happening in them is not the loss of personhood. They are as persons as anyone else is. What is happening is a different kind of disposition is being manifested in them, which means that they are not able to have the capacity that they used to exercise normally and freely. Now, they are not able. But that doesn't show the loss of capacity. It's a different manifestation of disposition, such that they are not able to manifest disposition A. Now they are manifesting disposition B, which means they are unable to exercise the capacity that they normally use to exercise, which means at no point personhood is lost. It's a different kind of manifestation.
May I ask a question this is a question that came in from the chat that actually relates to the point you just made. May I ask? It says, I understand all the relational and intellectual capabilities about the image of God and personhood. I think we can extend it. It is not a zygote who have no such capacity still possess the image of God. So this is essentially asking that question now, not with somebody with Alzheimer's, but what about a zygote?
Yeah, what we're talking about, like I said, we don't say this is a zygote with potential. We say this is we don't say that this is a potential human. We say that we say this is a human with potential. Right. And to go, this is one of why the doctrine of the resurrection is so important in the Christian faith, because it is at that time that our full potential is finally actualized, that which we are ultimately meant to be. And so we can look at all of the places in which we are deficient, or we're not, where we don't flourish in a particular way. Now, I think someone else is going to talk about the problem of evil, but this is one of the answers that we'd say, why is it that suffering is allowed? And that is that very process has a fashioning and shaping, and it could be that the reason that I am going through a particular suffering or difficulty may not be for me, but even for those who are called to minister to me in the place where I am suffering and falling short. And that all of this has that sanctifying process. And so we're not minimizing the suffering. We're not trying to paper over it and put a happy face on it. We are acknowledging the brutality and seriousness of that. But for those of us who have dealt with parents who were suffering from dementia, we know what a calling that is upon those who are now called to minister to them. And I'm speaking from a personal experience here. I'm not minimizing how hard that is. What I am saying, though, is that all things work together for good, in that there is a purpose that is being accomplished here, and that even those things will have the effect of allowing us to truly reach what God intends us to be. And so at the resurrection, I think there is an eschatological answer to the problem of evil. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers what they're looking for there.
So in a Christian anthropology, the unborn human is a person in development, and the infant is a person in development, rather than developing toward being a
Right.
person.
Yeah, and that's why we don't have an operational, I think we can have operational descriptions of a human, but I think we want to start, I think that's what our dear brother has been saying, is that we want to start with an ontological affirmation. And
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think there is a confusion when people think about personhood. Personhood historically is a person as a mask you put on your face to play the role of someone, for example. So that notion is what I call in my own written work the functional notion of personhood. So when people think about person, they literally say that unless that person plays a certain role prescribed, then that's not a person. Okay, here's an example. A person who's suffering from Alzheimer's disease or dementia or something like that, people say, okay, they don't have self-concept, they are not self-aware, now they have ceased to be a person. So they should have played the role of having the self-awareness and so on. Thinking about personhood in that way is flawed. We should think about personhood ontologically, which means Aristotle, for example, talked about actuality and potentiality. In metaphysics, that theta. Okay, so for Aristotle, you can only get actuality out of potentiality. If potentiality is not there, actuality is not going to come out at some point, along the continuum. So the two are interlocked. So when we think about what it means to be a person, a conceived entity is a person right there at the time of conception. And even prior to that, the individual cells, they do have a potential when they come together to create this miracle that we call a human being. So you can talk about potentiality in different ways, but what is problematic is to come up with this artificial criteria. If something is not satisfying this criteria that I put in place, then I can literally discriminate people, person, not person. Human person, not only human being. So here are the adjectives right now in the literature. There is a difference between a human being and a human person. Someone can be said to be a human being without being a human person. A human person is the one who is both a human being and a person. That coinage is deeply flawed.
Yeah, and
all human beings are human persons.
yeah, and like I said, whenever you start making that distinction, and I'm thinking they're ignoring the fact that they have the theological discussion that informed them. They don't even grasp the fact that they're using theological terms without.
So if you let me ask this question. So if you're saying that the concept of a person or an image bearer is an ontological category, doesn't it then lead to operational qualities, right? But you can't go from operational qualities to an ontological being. Is that what you're saying?
Here is a person does have qualities, as you've pointed out. Let's say self-concept and self-awareness and a host of other capacities. What if that person is unable to exercise those capacities, let's say because of dementia or some sort of mental illness or something like that? Right. Has he ceased to be a person? According to a modern definition of personhood, yes. From being a human being, became a human person, now became a human being, and then becomes a human vegetable. That person even will lose the human status. People in comatose, for some people, are not human beings. They are human vegetables.
And like I said, historically, the Greco-Roman world made a big distinction between there's plenty of humans, they're homo, they're not persons. Like I said, he's right in that the origin of the idea of persona is from the theater, wearing a mask. By the time we come up into the New Testament period, it now is applied to the status of a citizen. A Roman citizen is a persona. A slave is a homo. And so the wonderful contribution that the church made to Western thought is we are all in the image of God. So we're all persons. How are we supposed to understand persons? So there again, where the doctrines of the Trinity and the doctrine of Christ informed our very notion of what we understand a person to be. And so...
Second question.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Yeah, get to your second question.
My colleague Mark Perez and I just completed a manuscript with the working title, On Thinking Well, a Christian Guidebook to Logic, Reasoning, and Neutralizing Bias. Now I'm going to read, Mark Perez says this. He says, confirmation bias is the tendency to seek data to support one's own hypothesis and ignore or not see the data that do not confirm your hypothesis. He says Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman describes the problem, quote, contrary to the rules of philosophers of science who advise testing hypotheses by trying to refute them, people and scientists, quite often, seek data that are likely to be compatible with the beliefs they currently hold. Now, I would tell my students in a logic class or a philosophy class, I would say, tell me what the best argument is on the other side, and then tell me how you would respond. I'm going to present that to you. You both believe that human beings are exceptional. They're different in kind. What's the best argument that human beings are only different in degree in your mind?
You want to take it this one first?
I think you can do it probably what I attempted to say without covering everything that I had to, I prepared to say. There's a sense in which human beings are different in degrees in relation to what I call the easy problem of human exceptionalism. For example, or relativized exceptionality that I've talked about. I always get amazed how an ego is an excellent physicist. An ego, the focus, when an ego wants to land on a prey, the attention, the focus, the trajectory it takes, the speed, it's just unbelievable. But I always ask myself, which university did the ego go to understand this physics? Like, it's incredible. Yeah. We can't do that kind of stuff, we human beings. We have our own capacities, but animals are really surprising. And certain animals can sense certain things miles away, right? But we can't. So I think when we talk about animals and human beings, we have to admit they are superior to us in certain ways. But that doesn't undermine our ontological status that we have. It doesn't undermine that. It doesn't even come anywhere close to undermining that. It's simply saying that this is a creation of God. God somehow put this capacities in this animal, and it's just, I can't do that. So the degreed properties, degreed levels they can absolutely fit with what I called relativized exceptionality. So you can apply that principle among human beings within the human species or across human species and also other animals. So I think if I correctly understood your question, philosophically, there isn't a significant problem of me admitting in some sense, yeah, an ego is, I don't have that capacity, and I'm okay with that. Yeah. And an ego doesnn't have the capacities I do have. So it kind of, it balances itself. But we shouldn't make the mistake of inferring from that the ontological difference is somehow not there.
Yeah, epistemological virtue requires us to try to understand the strongest argument against our position. Darwin's second book on the descent of man, it was one long sustained argument that there is no difference in kind. It's strictly a difference of degree. And he went over and over. I mean, all of the various things that we talk about, the human, that makes us human. He said, no, whether it's even the sense of justice or moral choices, he tried to argue that we can see semblances of that in nature. It is difficult. I mean, you're asking me, so what are the arguments that keep me up at night? The whole thing about dealing with the spectrum. Think of the color red. Now, think of the spectrum, the color spectrum. At what point, as you move from the spectrum either to the left or the right, does it stop being red? And it's really tough to say, okay, it's now it's no longer red, it's orange or whatever. So that's tough. And biology is just like that to me. It just seems like, I do feel for biologists because it seems that everything is, you never step in the same river twice. It really does seem to be this mushy thing that's always in flux. Neanderthals, I mentioned that at the very end, and I am looking forward to hearing from those who know more about this than me, that it really does intrigue me how doggone close Neanderthals are to us, in that, they clothed themselves, they used fire, they buried their dead. And the fact that, not just that interbreeding happened, but the interbreeding produced fertile offspring. I mean, there's a lot of different species that interbreed, but they produce infertile offspring. I'm thinking, mules are an example of horses and donkeys, and you can have a mule, but the mule is infertile. So those kind of questions I'm still working on, and I look to my science friends to help me on that, because that does look like, that looks like a continuity question. I think there are good and reasonable answers, but you ask,
Yeah.
and so those are the ones that I struggle with.
Let's go to questions on our in-person audience. Question here. Do we have a microphone?
Relate at the microphone. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Keithley.
Well, get right up into the microphone, ma'am.
Okay. Oh, listen, I can hear myself now. You'd made a comment that the contemporary notion of person comes from our church fathers.
Yes.
But they only came to that notion because they were reflecting on Christ and who he is and what he did. But even going back further, can't we see at least the germ of person in the law, for instance, or maybe even back as far as Abraham? I would just like you to reflect on where that began and how it came to what I would say to Christ.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a development in Scripture. There is a progression to certain ideas. It's already been mentioned several times. Genesis 1, we have the explicit statement, let us make man in our image. That's a radical idea for the ancient Near Eastern context. Yes, the Egyptians thought that the Pharaoh was in the image of God, but not the slaves building the pyramid. The Babylonians had no notion of the divine image in humans at all. The Babylonians understood humans to be the slaves of the gods. In fact, that was explicitly taught. So you're right. There's already, but as theologians have pulled their hair, that's one of the reasons I don't have as much hair, is because the Genesis 1 affirms that we are in the divine image, but it doesn't tell us what the divine image is. I don't lose as much sleep about that as I used to, because I realize, I think, that even because what is it that God wants us to know there? Even if we never arrive at an understanding of the divine image, he wants us to know that every human being is in his image. And that's an ethical teaching. Therefore, what does it say in Genesis 9? We're not to murder. What does it say in James? We're not to treat people, we're not to curse and demean other people because they are made in the image of God. So the divine image is, you're right, all the way from the idea of the Old Testament. What I'm specifically talking about the church fathers developing, it's the notion of person. What do we mean by what do we mean when we say person? And that's why I find it just a little amusing when scientists are trying to, like Christian Smith, come up with a 30-point definition of what a person is, and you can't hardly. What they're trying to do is arrive scientifically at something that is fundamentally theological. So I was talking very specifically about person. Human value is taught all the way from the book of Genesis. Yeah.
One element, maybe to add to that, is by common grace, Aristotle and Plato could do good philosophy.
Amazing.
And they may want to contribute to that. Okay, did I see another question? Go up to the microphone, please.
Thank you. I'd like to just extend the argument that you were making on, it sounds like a necessary condition for a human to be considered a person is this self-awareness. And just to tee off of what Maurizio was saying about a person that's comatose is a human vegetable. And so if I was to take that logic, and I think this is right, but you guys can correct me. So the definition would be a person is self-aware. An infant is not self-aware, therefore infanticide is okay. That's what a non-Christian would say.
Yeah.
So if I get hit in the head and I become comatose, go to the hospital, as long as I'm not self-aware, it's okay to kill me. Or how about if I go to sleep? So it's okay to kill somebody if they're asleep. If I was to take that logical argument to that extreme, I just wonder if you'd comment on that.
Okay, there are many things that we can say about that. I think when you actually fall asleep, there's a hope that you will wake up tomorrow morning. But there are philosophers who think that when you actually fall asleep, you cease to exist. So a different self emerges the moment you wake up. So there's a sense in which that throughout the day you are coming in and out of existence based on how conscious you are. So consciousness for these philosophers is a degreed property. And along this line, a British philosopher by the name Galen Strawson argues along this line. So that's one thing. But if you run into that kind of accident, if something hits your head and you become completely unconscious and unable to remember who you are, who the people you love are, and so on, and if you stay in that kind of state for an extended period of time, let's suppose for 6 months, for a year, and so on, some philosophers will call you have now ceased not only to be a person, you have ceased to be a human being. Now you are in comatose. So you have been degraded like two levels downward. I think this is deeply not only disturbing, it's philosophically for me totally incoherent and problematic stuff. People in comatose state, in fact, there are many research, they actually were cognizant of what was happening in their surroundings, but they were not able to respond to the stimulus, like physically the way that they used to. And some regained consciousness, and they were able to tell accurate stories regarding what their family members were saying, complaining, we can't take care of this person forever and blah, blah. You know, you've been saying that. What? You know? So these people know certain comatose situations, of course, are not reversible. Some are irreversible. I'm just talking about the reversible ones. We can't distinguish that until the person regains consciousness. But the bottom line is, what exactly is the criteria that we are entitled to come up with to categorize people, human being, human person, and human vegetable? No. The problem of criteria that I talked about tonight is an answer. You can't come up with that. So I would say comatose patients are persons, no less, no more, just the way I am a person. Right? That's how I see
Let's remember the self-awareness criteria is Peter Singer's. In the Greco-Roman world, it didn't matter if they were aware or not. I mean, let's remember it's a world in which gladiators killed each other, and people watched it for entertainment. It took the church. Not only did it take, the church a long time to get across the notion that killing one another for fun is wrong because these are persons, but even the church itself had to learn and come around to the full implications. For example, I can try to remember who talked about the Cappadocian Fathers. It was you. The Cappadocian Fathers were magnificent in how they taught that how Christians are supposed to behave. And so it was Gregory of Nyssa who preached the very first sermon that we have record of, in which he said, in principle, slavery is wrong. That slavery, because you're enslaving another human being who is a person in the image of God, it is therefore fundamentally immoral to enslave someone. And yet, Nyssa's, Gregory's message really didn't penetrate the church for over 1,000 years. And so we're still, I would say, in the process of coming to understand the full implications of what it means to treat everyone as a person in the image of God. I think we're still working on what does that mean.
We have time for one more question. We're going to take it from, do you have a question here?
Oh, yeah.
Live stream.
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions coming in on the chat. So a lot of them we can actually engage tomorrow. So don't think we're ignoring your questions. But this is kind of a fun question to end with. But actually it's a serious question that's remarkably applicable to some of the things we're going to be addressing in the future. Are fictional superheroes examples of difference in degree or kind from normal humans? What powers would make a superhero different in kind? Now, where this actually becomes a relevant question is the transhumanism movement, right? Where we have the technology, or at least on the cusp of having the technology to enhance human beings beyond our natural biological limit, where some transhumanists even think that we should use the technology to evolve us into post-humans that would be different in kind. So just a fun question, but actually a pertinent question in many respects.
Well, I always thought it was fascinating how in so many, like Star Trek, how many different alien species are able to interbreed. You know, how you have these half Vulcan, half human, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, how did that happen? You know, they're
Yeah, human Neanderthal interbreeding is nothing.
yeah, nothing compared to that. Oh my goodness. Well, that goes back to the simple question, would Superman, that's one of the questions that C.S. Lewis asked. Would an alien need to be saved? And so we would understand that Adam's sin affected Adam's posterity. And so I would say that as long, to that degree, if we're talking about aliens, but now in terms of what would it take for something to happen to humans so they'd no longer
Be humans.
Yeah.
I think I work on philosophy of artificial intelligence, so I'm working on an argument that I'm calling ontological superiority. And I'm also trying to come up with a mathematical model that shows the in-principle impossibility of doing that kind of stuff. And my model is simply a very simple model, n+1. For any progress that human beings make in making technologies as sophisticated as they want, they are always one step ahead, which means that they are maintaining their ontological, unbreachable ontological superiority over their own gadgets that they are inventing. So we can talk about this tomorrow, but I can lay out my argument that I'm calling very nice, yummy argument like American hamburger. Ontological superiority. And we will see how it goes. But I think my official position is transhumanists will not succeed. It's metaphysically impossible for human beings to do that kind of thing.
So in other words, if we bear God's image, there's an ontological status that we have as image bearers that cannot be
breached.
Transcended or because of technological modifications.
We do have a biblical, there's an interesting question about what's going on in Genesis chapter 6. There does not, when Adam sinned, it does not seem to have affected the angels. In other words, yes, it affected the created order, the material created world, but, and we'd say that because of Adam's sin, we're all humans are affected by it. But the angels, the elect angels were not. And so I would, and I know it's going to be a disappointment to some, we're not going to become angels, we're not going to get our wings. So I would argue that there is a difference there that doesn't seem to be, we don't see, there's a gap there that I don't see us breaching.
Here is one very straightforward example, if we have 1 minute. I don't know.
Actually, Hugh wanted to ask a question.
Right, okay.
Since he's a founder, I'm going to say he gets the question.
This will be really quick. I was rather shocked. You both mentioned this self-awareness issue with toddlers. And I'm thinking, surely somebody's pushed back on this because, my memory goes back to when I was 2. I know I was self-aware at age 2. I did experiments on both of my sons shortly after they were born.
You and I believe that.
So, and when they were a few months old, what I discovered is they really do have a theory of mind. Mm-hmm. So they have to be self-aware, even at just a few months of age. I can't be the only one that's figured this out. Somebody must have published something that pushes back strongly against the Peter Singers of the world. Yeah. I'm wondering if you could illuminate us.
Yeah. There are tons of research on infant recognition, and infants are always exploring their environment. They are always sucking in the data from the environment that they are whatever that's around them. They are not passive at all. There are neuroscientists who have carried out these research, and I will be happy to bring some of those tomorrow, just concretely to mention what these research are. You're absolutely right. They might not be able to use language to say that, oh, this is what I'm thinking, or, but the capacity is there. It's a matter of time, but they are completely surveying their environment, interacting with their environment. They are busy in doing so. Their brain is really working very, very actively. So I think it's not outrageous. It's not far-fetched. What you say is grounded in current ongoing research. And I'll be happy to bring some things tomorrow.
But even in the womb, a developing fetus is interacting with the exterior world, right? Yeah.
There are research that when I was in UK, the university where I was doing a PhD, they released, I think from the university or from somewhere in UK, there are research that are indicating the fetus inside the womb of the mother can recognize mom's voice relative to other voices. They react to mom's voice in a way that they do not react to other voices and so on. So I think there are many, many research here. But if you allow me just one, I'm itching, right?
Okay.
The example that I'm going to use is not going to be embraced by so many people. It's only be kind of example that only Christians, or already they have a Christian worldview in place. They can argue with that. I'm just saying that in response to your question. Consider, for example, those people who believe in the existence of God, and those people who believe that God created them. Okay, they wouldn't accept the premise. If we could do such and such, we can bridge the ontological gap between us and God. It only takes us like doing X, Y, Z. After that, God is going to be an afterthought, okay? He's going to be like shoulder to shoulder like with God. Let's go to Starbucks and sit down and drink coffee. If you will never be able to narrow the ontological gap between you and God, no matter what you end up doing, using the mind you have, creating any kind of sophisticated technology that you could possibly imagine, you can use that argument and apply it to our own case. If we are bringing technologies as a result of our own creativity, we are their gods. We're creating them. Let's say robots populate the state of Nevada and then start doing their own thing. They go to office, they have their own kids, they just hang around Starbucks and talk about their problems and so on. But we started the initial spark, okay? So the ontological superiority is saying, which is the argument that I'm working on, no matter what they end up doing, it took me to start the initial spark, so that I maintain that ontological superiority. And that ontological superiority has nothing to do with how many things you do in order to bridge it. It's kind of in-principle-based argument. That's it, case closed. So I'm not going to be able to narrow the gap between myself and God, no matter what I end up doing. Even if I solve all the mysteries that we are struggling in our universe currently, that's not going to put me in a position to say, oh, now, okay, the difference between me and God has vanished. So I think we can talk about this tomorrow, but that's where I'm going with my argument, and I don't know, maybe I can receive Nobel Prize, who knows what.
Okay, we're going to go to George.
Can we give them a hand?